Hello, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the third and last day of our symposium on Italian drawings from the 20th century. My name is Edouard Kopp. I'm Chief Curator of the Menil Drawing Institute in Houston. The symposium really aims to explore some aspects of the generative and often overlooked role that drawing has played throughout the 20th century in Italy. The symposium is organized in conjunction with the exhibition Silent Revolutions, Italian Drawings from the 20th Century, on view at the Menil Drawing Institute through April 11th. And I'm thrilled to be joined on the screen by one of my co-organizers, Saskia Verlaan. Hello, Saskia.
Hello, greetings from Houston.
So Saskia is the Menil Drawing Institute's inaugural pre-doctoral fellow and also PhD candidate at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. And together, along with our co-organizer, Irina Zucca Alessandrelli, who's also the show's co-curator and one of the speakers of today, together we would like to thank the partner institutions that have really helped us greatly in promoting this event, and namely the Cultural Office of the Italian Embassy in Washington, D.C., the Italian Consulate in Houston, Collezione Ramo in Milan, as well as our colleagues at Magazzino Italian in Springfield, New York. And before we start, some quick housekeeping notes. There will be a discussion and Q&A following the last of our three talks. Please submit your questions via Zoom's Q&A function, which is located at the bottom of your screens. And you can do that at any time throughout the program. And please be sure to indicate for whom your question is intended. And should you encounter any technical difficulties, you can reach out to us using the chat function. So today's panel is going to focus on drawing in relation to the interconnection between Italian and American art during the 20th century. And we're going to explore some cross currents in drawing practices between Italian and American artists. Based on mutual discovery and reception, the international artistic exchange had varied connotations with a long-lasting impact on American and Italian artists alike, which raised questions about personal as well as national artistic identity that were not always devoid of tensions. The panel will also address the role played by collectors, critics, curators, and dealers, which together form strong networks of relationships. The role that institutions, biennales, museums, and states played in this complex and evolving artistic exchange will also be touched upon. And all this unfolded against a background of events affecting national situations and international relations, such as the First World War, the rise of fascism, the Second World War, the Marshall Plan, the economic boom of the post-war period, the Cold War, and so on. The interconnections between Italian and American arts during the 20th century constitute a vast and fascinating topic, which has been well studied in the case of certain artists. I'm thinking, for example, of Emily Brown's study on the Chirico in America, or Flavio Vergonzi's book on the impact of Jasper Jones in Italy. And some scholars have sought to situate Italian art movements, such as Arte Povera, in a wider international context. More generally, the book, edited by Germano Celant and Anna Constantini, entitled Roma, New York, An Art Exploration, 1948 to 1964, which was published in 1993, remains an indispensable resource. Also noteworthy is Raffaele Bedarida's recent work on cultural diplomacy, which I will mention in a moment when I introduce him. But in a way, none of these publications, however, focused particularly on drawing, which is why we thought that this panel might be welcome. Silent Revolutions features several works that fit in with that story of exchange. In a drawing made in New York in 1930 by the futurist Fortunato De Pero, we see a vision of the American metropolis with a scene featuring people on an elevated train at its center and skyscrapers in the background. The composition is compressed, fragmented, and spatially fairly incoherent. It seems to allude to the intense, disorientating, and hyper-stimulating urban experience associated with a city then considered a beacon of modernity. Another work in the exhibition is Pinot Pascalis' Untitled Notes from 1964, which is part of a group of drawings that Pascali made right after seeing Jasper Jones' pavilion at the 1964 Venice Biennale. This was also the year when Robert Rauschenberg won the Best Foreign Paintings Prize. Pascali's drawing is a witty graphic homage to Jones, whose name he plays with in a very pop way, as if it were a trademark of consumerist society. But above all, it seems that the drawing appears to signal that the new aesthetic era had come, namely pop art was on the way. There's also Aldo Mondino's Brücke, a drawing from the 1980s, made with enamel paint on paper, which depicts the Brooklyn Bridge. As Jasper Jones would put it, it's a thing the mind already knows. And yet, using the graphic aesthetic of the German expressionist woodcut, Aldo Mondino is really displacing an iconic landmark of New York, the Brooklyn Bridge, and displacing it culturally and temporally, and making it defamiliarized as a result. So the papers today range in approach from transversal to monographic, but also in terms of time period, from the fascist era to the 1980s. But as you will see, they share some common threads. And so now I'd like to invite our first speaker, Raffaele Vedarida, to join me.
Hello.
Raffaele, great to have you. So Raffaele is an art historian specializing in 20th century Italian art and politics. His research has especially focused on cultural diplomacy, migration, and exchange between Italy and the United States. He is an assistant professor of art history at the Cooper Union, where he coordinates the history and theory of arts program. Raffaele holds an MA from the Università di Siena and a PhD from the City University of New York Graduate Center. His doctoral dissertation was titled Export-Import, the Promotion of Contemporary Italian Art in the United States from 1935 to 1969. And his PhD analyzed how the exportation of Italian contemporary art will fashion Italian national identity in the process. In 2012, he published a fascinating article in the Oxford Art Journal titled Operation Renaissance, Italian Art at MoMA, 1940 to 49, which, by focusing on the genesis of the landmark 1949 MoMA exhibition, 20th Century Italian Art, so to show how an understanding of modern Italian art from Umberto Boccioni to Lucio Fontana entered American museums and was historicized after World War II. Vedarida's most recent book focuses on the US exile of Jewish queer artist Corrado Kali from fascist Italy. It is called Corrado Kali, La Pittura, L'esilio, l'America, published by Donzelli in 2018, and with an English translation or edition forthcoming. And finally, Raffaele is currently working on a new manuscript titled Projected Modernities, Exhibiting Italian Art in the US, Futurism to Arte Povera. So now, Raffaele, over to you.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. All right. Thank you, Edouard, for the introduction, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. This was a great opportunity for me because I've been studying the use of contemporary Italian art in cultural diplomacy with the United States during fascism and the Cold War, but I never really paid specific attention to drawing. So as I approached today's research, I was asking myself questions such as, were there any drawings, and what was their role in this history of transnational exchange? So first, I want to provide a little bit of context about my research to explain my angle today. So increasingly during the fascist regime, and then in the post-war moment, Italian artists, curators, and dealers made an active effort to promote contemporary Italian art in the United States, first with the support of Mussolini's regime, and then of the post-war governments. My first argument is that the strategies developed during fascism informed post-war modes of promotion, although the rhetoric and the political context changed. The second thesis is that beyond the political goal of propaganda and beyond the economic interest in a growing American art market, the Italian organizers were invested in projecting a certain image of a modern self, specifically in the United States, which was seen as a symbol and as a model of modernity. Those exhibitions organized for an American audience ultimately functioned as a laboratory through which the Italians elaborated and changed their modern national identity in close conversation with the United States. This happened both in large institutional exhibitions. Here on the left is a view of the Italian pavilion at the New York World's Fair of 1939. On the right is the MoMA show, 20th Century Italian Art of 1949. But also in smaller initiatives, such as the privately owned Cometa Gallery in New York. And here in the bottom left, you see a photo from the inaugural show, or above you see images from Eterna Primavera, an exhibition organized by Irene Brin and Gasparo del Corso, the owners of the Roman gallery L'Obelisco. This show was circulating through the United States, and here we are seeing it at the Peirce Gallery in Beverly Hills, as captured in a Hollywood movie of the time. Now, the role of drawing in transnational exchange is counterintuitive to a certain degree, because although works on paper are more portable and did cross the Atlantic on both directions, cultural diplomats emphasized work that they believed would be more impactful in the other country, that is painting and sculpture. Futurist artist Fortunato De Pero is a case in point. He's the first Italian artist to cross the Atlantic with the deliberate goal to conquer the American art scene, which, like many Italians, he saw as dominated by the French school and therefore biased against Italy. So here on the left, you see De Pero leaving for New York with boxes of paintings and tapestries, which he called bombs that he wanted to throw against the New York skyscraper. So they had to be impactful. Whereas on the right, you see Fortunato and Rosetta De Pero in New York with the famous Bolted book, which was conceived as a portable museum showcasing De Pero's ability as a graphic designer, reproducing his paintings, his sculptures, his manifestos, but not so much his drawings. Now, drawings were there, but they were almost invisible. So for example, here you can see this was the brochure of the main exhibition done by De Pero in New York. And you see that the paintings are named and the tapestries with all of the titles, whereas drawings and posters, they were many of them, 27 items. However, we don't have the titles. And also in the private notes by De Pero, we can see that drawing actually featured as an important source of income. However, the other works are named individually, and drawing is just indicated as disegno. So we don't know how many were sold, which one of them. So my question is one of content as much as of method. If the circulation of drawing is so hard to document and research, how do we study and understand their presence and their cultural role in a transnational perspective? So I have identified the three main examples that I want to approach as both case studies and as interpretive frameworks. The example of De Pero is especially significant for it makes it visible how important is drawing in the reflective phenomenon that I was mentioning earlier. There is the effort of the effort to project an Italian modernity reflected back onto the Italians who ended up absorbing and importing American models on their way back. De Pero's impact in New York was in fact very limited. He was not very successful during his time there. But after he returned to Italy, he kept elaborating on what he had seen in New York for over a decade. And the drawings that he brought back from the US, along with photographs and writing, were a major tool for that process. So here on the left, you see one of his New York drawings. But then on the right, you see it published 5 years later when De Pero was back in Italy in the influential magazine L'Illustrazione Italiana, in an article in which De Pero described New York as a futurist work of art as a whole. Another example is this painting here on the right, which was exhibited by De Pero at the Venice Biennale in 1932. This painting was made in Italy, but it was based on previous drawings done in New York. And actually here there is another methodological issue in the sense that many of these drawings then remained with the artist in the studio. And sometimes it's hard to tell, whereas they were preparatory drawings for the painting, or if they were made after the painting, as the artist changed the titles and the dates afterwards, sometimes with mistakes. Like other Italian travelers, De Pero was shocked by racial segregation in the United States, but he was also enthusiastic about the vibrancy of Black culture in the midst of the Harlem Renaissance. At the same time, he reproduced racist stereotypes in his work. So he brought back this ambivalent vision of the American model when he returned to Italy. De Pero's New York drawing, inspired by the skyscrapers, would be included in several publications. And one of them was Numero Unico Campari, which you see here on the right. And in this volume, De Pero published his Manifesto of Futurist Advertising. And there he discussed advertising as the new form of art, and New York as a source of inspiration for this. So here you see the Italian brand Campari that is placed on the New York skyscrapers, which function as a pedestal for promotion. In the 1930s, De Pero became a leading figure of Italian Americanismo, which was a cultural obsession with everything American as a model of modernity. So the Paris drawing, brought back from the United States, functioned as a material avenue through which the phenomenon of Americanism developed in Italy. The second case study is the Cometa Gallery, which I already mentioned briefly. This was a Roman gallery, and it inaugurated a New York branch in 1937. And therefore became a major outpost for Italian cultural diplomacy in the United States. Here you see the ambassador at the opening of the gallery with an exhibition entitled Anthology of Contemporary Italian Painting. And the second group show organized at the Cometa had a similar title, Anthology of Contemporary Italian Drawing, and here you see the catalog. And it was conceived as a counterpart of the first exhibit, as declared also in the exhibition catalog. And I want to quote briefly from that text. having seen how the Italian painters expressed themselves by means of colors and tonalities, now the American public will be able to judge the delicate and original manner in which they approach the simple and yet severe art of design. And so these terms, delicate, original, simple, severe, were very important to describe and promote drawing, but also they were presented as something specific about Italian modernity. From day one, the Cometa had valued drawing. The Roman headquarters of the gallery indeed inaugurated in 1935 with a drawing show of Corrado Kali, including a manifesto-like piece by Massimo Bontempelli, Idea sul disegno. Bontempelli was an influential author, and he wrote about the centrality of drawing as first an autonomous art form, independent from painting and sculpture, and also as a tool to start a new visual vocabulary from scratch. The implicit message was that the new vocabulary was needed for the new era of fascism. In the US context, so going back to the drawing exhibit, the delicate nature of drawing, along with the simplicity and severity, were presented as specific features of the Italian way to modernity, as embodied by drawings of artists like Kali, of Capogrossi, and Morandi. Through their drawings, they were presented as more subtle and sophisticated than the celebrated names of the School of Paris, against which the Italians fought a permanent battle. The Cometa also presented drawing as a way to access better known artists such as De Chirico or Carrà on an intimate and more authentic level. This marketing strategy was not particularly successful in the immediate moment, so the show did not receive much attention, but it initiated an interpretive mode that would continue in the post-war moment. A major example would be much later in 1961, a show of works on paper by Boccioni that you see here on the right from the Lydia Wistel-Malbin collection. And this was organized at MoMA concurrently with the major futurism show seen here on the left, held at the same museum. Both in the press releases and in the curatorial approach, the Boccioni drawing exhibit was presented as independent and also more intimate than the larger futurism show, which did include drawings, as you can see here. But the drawing was presented as documentation, as the context for the final masterpiece. The third example is that of Corrado Kali. Drawing played a very important yet different role in the transatlantic trajectory of this artist. Kali was a Jewish, openly gay artist who had a stellar career in fascist Italy until the anti-Semitic racial laws of 1938 forced him to leave the country. So here in this picture, you see him in Baltimore, where he first settled in 1939. He left behind a thriving career as a theorist and a leader of the revival of muralism and public monumental art in the 1930s. So here on the left, you see a fountain that he designed with the rationalist architect Mario Ridolfi in 1935. On the right is a mural that Kali did for the Milanese Triennale of 1933. He was also involved in the effort during the 1930s to promote contemporary Italian art in the United States. So I've shown you this already, this image. I wanted to share also a color reproduction of this painting, which was widely reproduced in the New York Times and in other reviews. We can say that Kali was the main artist promoted by the Cometa Gallery in the 30s. As we saw, Kali had always valued drawing. So this was the first show he did in this gallery in 1935 as a young artist, and it focused on drawing. But during the 10 years that Kali spent in exile, drawing became the only medium practiced by the artist, partly because of his nomadic lifestyle as he moved around without a proper studio. And so here, what you see is part of a series of drawings from the post-war moment called Atelier, in which Kali depicted imaginary studios, and in them he put potential work that he could have done as a painter, but did not. More significantly, Kali utilized drawing to rethink and critique fascist visual rhetoric, including in his own previous work. So here he used the Jewish and homoerotic iconography and strategies of irony to subvert fascist tropes of Italy's glorious artistic legacy and the civilizing mission. So on the left here, you see one of the many versions of David and Goliath that he started doing after 1938. And on the right is one of the allegories. Here you see this a phallic column that is utilized as the useless battering ram to break through the open door of an arch of triumph. Other allegories alluded to the masochistic rhetoric of military power that Kali himself had helped constructing. So here is an archer whose arrows are actually coming back and hit the body of the archer himself. Here is a Saint Sebastian statue that is punctured with a drill and turned into a fountain of blood. Or on the right here, we have this mythological creatures that don't know what to do with themselves, that have lost their kind of mission. The technique is also interesting as Kali traced these images blindly by drawing with a metallic nail on white paper pressed against a leaf of dried oil paint, so that the resulting mark would appear on the verso of the paper. So both the absurdist imagery and the blind drawing technique made these pieces appealing to the surrealist environment. The surrealists had just reached New York in exile, and the New York gallery of Julian Levy, which was mostly known for having brought surrealism to the US, exhibited these in 1940. In 1941, Kali joined the US Army, and during the 3 years of military training on the West Coast, he documented military life, yet avoiding the heroic rhetoric of wartime propaganda. He especially focused on pensive or tired people, moments of melancholia, of boredom, or homoerotic closeness. But he also used drawing to explore the process of renegotiating identity while in exile. And so he translates everyday realities into allegorical or visionary scenes in which present situations and the actual landscapes in the state of Washington, Oregon, California, where he was, overlap with the memories of our historical and mythological imagery, which kind of come in as an interference. During the military campaigns in Europe, Kali keeps drawing, and he merges the actual battles and events that he was witnessing, such as the invasion of Normandy or the American bombing of St. Lo, with ancient history and biblical scenes that are totally out of place. And so the result is this kind of implosion of the humanistic tradition. He also emphasized with violent precision cities in rubble, crowds of displaced people, and the horrors of the German concentration camps. Part of these drawings were published in magazines and exhibited in real time during the war, but mostly that's how Kali came back to New York after the war and exhibited these pieces, and some of them were acquired by museums. With these drawings, Kali also reappeared on the Italian scene. And it's interesting that in his correspondence, Kali often uses a metaphor of a line in a drawing, which he compared to the web of a spider, which is a stretched thin through the events and the transformations of life as a way to trace one's trajectory but also to keep things together in spite of fragmentation and the trauma. So in a moment when everybody in Italy, right after the war, wanted to start over from scratch, Kali exhibited and published this body of work as a way to force the Italian public to deal with issues of memory and continuity with the fascist past. So, and understandably, it didn't go well, resulting in its ostracism and even in violence. Many of these drawings were purchased by important US institutions, such as MoMA, but they were kept in storage for decades. However, they proved valuable tools whenever those museums chose to rethink their narrative, especially in recent years. For example, this happened with the 2018 MoMA show dedicated to Lincoln Kingston as a way to approach the history of MoMA beyond the dominant narrative revolving around Alfred Barr and through a queer studies perspective. So on that occasion, Kali's drawing, along with many others, resurfaced from the storage and helped tell a different story. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Raffaele. That was really excellent. And, I think it's such an interesting framework to think about drawings and this issue of exchange. So thank you very much for that. I'd like to now welcome to the screen Irina Zucca Alessandrelli. Hi, Irina.
Yeah. Greetings from Milan.
Irina is an art historian, curator, and journalist based in Milan, Italy. She has been a curator for Collezione Ramo since 2013. She has been the curator of Collezione Ramo since 2013. The collection focuses on the importance of Italian art of the last century while promoting a culture of drawing. And I have to add here that Irina's knowledge and eye have shaped this into such a rich resource for understanding the range and depth of graphic expression in Italy during the 20th century. Before Silent Revolutions, in addition to making the acquisitions for Collezione Ramo, Irina curated, among other shows, Who's Afraid of Drawing, presented at the Museo del Novecento in Milan and at the Esteric Collection in London in 2018. She holds a BA in Modern and Contemporary Italian Art from the Università degli Studi di Milano and an MA in Curatorial Studies from Columbia University in New York, where she studied as a Fulbright Scholar. She has worked at PS1, MoMA, and the Philadelphia Museum of Arts. She corresponded from New York for the Italian financial newspaper Il Sole 24 Ore for the Art Economy page. She is the author of Italian Drawing of the 20th Century, which has been an ever-present companion for many of us at the Menil for the run of Silent Revolutions, and is the source for anyone hoping to learn more about Collezione Ramo. Before Irina starts her talk, I also just want to remind everybody of the Q&A, and if you have any questions, please feel free to submit them throughout the talks today or at the end. But yes, please feel free to give us your questions, and we'll try to address everything at the end of the session today. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Saskia, for your very kind introduction. And I want to thank also the Menil Drawing Institute staff and the Collezione Ramo, my staff in Milan, especially Giovanni Cestari for the technical support. In this session, I will be speaking about three artists, Afro, Fabio Mauri, and Tano Festa, because their work is emblematic of the various relationships between Italian and American culture during the post-war era. Afro great success in the States, a story which is now almost completely forgotten, illustrates how the American art world felt that Italy was producing the most interesting and most commercially appealing work of any European nation, before New Dada and pop art definitely focused the attention of Americans on their own domestic art scene. Mauri's work exemplifies another kind of relationship, being inspired not so much by American art as by its so-called low culture. Finally, Festa imagery reveals how during the late 60s, Italian artists looked to America before the advent of pop art, without ever forgetting their own great master or losing a sense of their Italian identity. something that was an important feature of 20th century Italian art in general. I hope that my talk will clarify these points for you. Afro-Basaldella's relationship with the United States began early in his career. In 1937, he had his first solo exhibition at the Galleria della Cometa, established in Rome 2 years early by Countess Mimi Peciblant. For almost 20 years, Afro collaborated with the New York gallerist Catherine Viviano, who had previously been the assistant of the dealer Pierre Matisse. In January 1950, she opened her own gallery in New York and focused its exhibition program on modern Italian art, just as Matisse had concentrated on French art. When Viviano offered Afro his first solo show in the United States in May 1950, most Americans' knowledge of Italian art was limited to the Renaissance, with possibly some awareness of the Chirico works and of early futurist imagery. However, Afro's painting had in fact already been featured in MoMA, in the exhibition 20th Century Italian Art, curated by Alfred Barr and James Charles Selby in 1949. You can see here his painting on the left wall. They had been selected on the basis of a solo show of the artist's work organized by the Galleria dell'Obelisco in 1948. Which had been visited by the MoMA curators in preparation for their own show. The Galleria dell'Obelisco was the first gallery to reopen in Rome following World War II. After New York exhibition of 1950 was hugely successful, and important American institutions such as the Albright Knox Art Gallery in Buffalo and the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia immediately acquired painting by the artist. He had already established connection with a number of Americans based in Rome before his first visit to New York in 1950, for which he was truly prepared. This included Patrick Kelleher, director of the Buffalo Museum, who knew Afro from the 2 years he had spent in the capital, and Philip Gaston, who was based at the city's American Academy after winning the Prix de Rome in 1948. In 1954, he took part in the show Young Italian Painters, Eterna Primavera, at the Contemporary Art Center in Cincinnati, and subsequently participated in the traveling show Contemporary Italian Painting, which toured to Chicago, Los Angeles, Santa Barbara, San Francisco, and New York between 1954 and 1955. His works were also featured in the show The New Decade, 22 European painters and sculptors curated by Andrew Richard for the New York's MoMA in 1955. That April, another highly successful solo exhibition of his painting opened at Catherine Viviano Gallery. In 1956, he was awarded the prize for Best Italian Artist at the Venice Biennale, but his profile was so much higher in the United States that in his native country, he was nicknamed the American by his Italian friends. His American collectors included Joseph Pulitzer, Stanley Seeger, Ralph Lamberson, and Vincent Price, illustrating the esteem in which his work was held at the time. Developing such strong links with American culture during the late 40s and 50s, Afro was in fact something of a pioneer. At the time, Catherine Viviano was convinced that Italian artists represented a solid investment, their work being rooted in the great innovation of their European avant-garde and in the country's own strong national artistic tradition. The success of her gallery program demonstrated that many in the American art world share a belief that Italy possessed the strongest European cultural identity in the immediate post-war period. As a consequence, perhaps Viviano did not encourage Afro to associate with contemporary American painters after he arrived in New York, and instead focused his attention on the established world of galleries and important collectors. In developing his own highly successful accession, Afro began revisiting imagery produced by historical avant-garde movements. Let's briefly consider the stylistic approaches he adopted on his way to achieving artistic maturity. This drawing of a boat contained clear reference to the kind of imagery that was associated with the Futurist movement and recalls Giacomo Valla Vortex, which is now currently on display in Silent Revolution. In this work, on the other hand, we can discern a clear reference to the Cubist vocabulary, although shortly afterward, Afro would move toward greater compositional freedom. This drawing relates to Afro fascination with New York's skyscraper and skyline. In it, we can make out a cluster of vertical form and soaring rectangles distinguished from one another by different decorative themes. They vividly evoke the city complex urban fabric. Dated 1951, it is a transitional work created when Afro was beginning to move toward abstraction. This piece, on the other hand, dated 1953, retains the intimacy of the precise memory that almost seems to bloom on the page against a pale background, with its elevated perspective and the central section that appears to depict a road snaking between tall buildings with pedestrians or vehicles moving along it. The work suggests a city street view from above, although the scene is evoked in a fundamentally abstract key. This collage of 1960 reflects Afro-mature style. Here, the colors are more fluid and the forms are less angular, allowing him to achieve a new sense of compositional freedom. Verticality is also abandoned in favor of an horizontal format. In defining his chromatic planes, the artist employed colors recalling those used by Titian and Veronese, which he had studied during his time at the Academy in Venice. Let's now consider the connection between Afro's work and that of his contemporaries in the United States. In 1955, Jean-Paul Slasser, director of the Michigan University Museum of Art, highlighted the sense of compositional balance and quiet lyricism typical of Afro's work, which he compared to that of Arshile Gorky, while in 1956, Venice Biennale catalog, the American curator Andrew Ritchie identified Afro's depth to expressionism in his journey toward total abstraction. However, it is interesting to note that in the many letters sent to friends back in Italy during the first 8 months visit to New York, Afro never mentioned any American artists or referred to abstract expressionism. In 1956, the Rome-based magazine Arte Visive, which had been established in 1952 by a group of artists, including Toti Shaloya, Afro's close friend, dedicated an entire issue to Gorky. The following year, Afro helped to organize what was the first European retrospective devoted to the Armenian American artist, who had died prematurely in 1948 when he was only 44 years old. 29 drawings and several oils were included in the show, which was held at Rome Galleria dell'Obelisco. It proved to be incredibly successful. The introduction to the catalog, signed by Afro, but possibly written by Shaloya, according to Gabriela Drubi, was composed late in the artist's career, many years after his own abstract works, and had first been exhibited at Galleria dell'Obelisco in 1948. The text stated, and I quote, "Gorky was the first American painter, the first artist who expressed an absolutely new cultural situation. His style of painting gave me courage, intrepid, excited, full of love. Arshile Gorky taught me to seek my truth without false shame, to search only within myself. In recent years, American painting has assumed a leading role in world discourse. American artists pay for their sincerity to the point of torment by turning out quickly. In this way, by burning out quickly. But in this way, American painters have prolonged and kept alive a truth born in Europe. Arshile Gorky was the first of this intrepid group of artists. There is a desperate naivety in his eyes and a will to love, a poignant awareness of the pain of the war." Afro heartfelt text, written 9 years after Gorky's death, look back to the artist's production of the 1940s with a sense of gratitude and esteem for a fragile yet powerful artist who had died far too young. Of course, Afro did not only know Gorky's work from his trips to New York. For instance, he had been shown at the 1948 Venice Biennale, where it was displayed in the American pavilion, as well as in the Greek pavilion, where Peggy Guggenheim was exhibiting her collection. Gorky's significance for Afro was largely a consequence of his relationship with the Parisian surrealists, as well as his link to the circle of artists in exile that orbited around Pierre Matisse in New York, in particular Roberto Echavarria Matta. Afro seems particularly drawn to the expressive quality of Gorky's art and his talent for evoking memories of the past in ostensibly abstract compositions. After 1956, Afro's own style grew increasingly gestural and spontaneous, his black marks becoming far more distinctive and emotionally expressive in character. His drawings of the early 1960s reflect his new sense of freedom, being set down on the paper with little or no forethought. Afro's frequent trip to the United States during the late 50s enabled him to maintain his friendship with artists such as de Kooning, Rothko, Conrad Marcarelli, and Philip Gaston, who in turn considered Afro their point of reference whenever they visited Italy. The Kooning example would prove particularly significant for the Italian painter. In 1959, he stayed in Afro's Roman studio for 3 months. This was a period of intense and fruitful artistic exchange, resulting in some black and white gouache that de Kooning gave to Afro and Shaloya. One of these works found its way into the Menil collection. While here you can see the work that de Kooning dedicated to Afro. Rather than the Kooning style, it was his method of working that most influenced Afro, being much more immediate and automatic than his own. Afro would abandon his intellectual approach during the 1960s and begin experimenting with black and white freehand drawings. To conclude on Afro, it's interesting to read James Charles Sobe's introduction to the catalog of the exhibition Italian Art of the 20th Century from American Collection, which was presented at the Milan in Palazzo Reale in 1960. Sobe's text was written after a decade of major shows by Afro in the United States, and I quote, "Immediately after the Second World War, Americans began to take an interest in what young Italian painters were creating, and in the last 12 years, various of our museums, collectors, and art dealers have exhibited and bought work by these artists with an ever-increasing pace. Of them, the best known among us is certainly Afro, an intelligent artist and an enchanting colorist. Our exhibition aims to document American preferences for contemporary Italian artists that we in the United States cherish with veneration and pride." If the curator of MoMA lavished such praise on Afro, his works in American museums would not have gone unnoticed by American artists who move in the same circles and whose works were bought by the same collectors. As we know, the flow of ideas never goes in just one direction. And let's now consider a totally different kind of cultural exchange between Italy and the United States by examining the work of Fabio Mauri. In Italy, the links between art and advertising had grown increasingly close, but if we consider the reciprocal influence of the so-called low culture on the fine arts, this did not take place until the 1950s, although from the 1930s, several artists collaborated with large companies for advertising material on a wide range of products. Mauri embraced popular culture more than any other artist at this time, anticipating the preoccupation of later movements in both his native country and abroad. His fascination with this world developed as a child, when his father had introduced Mickey Mouse and Flash Gordon comics to Italy through the publishing houses Mondadori and Nerbini. The family home was full of this publication, and as children, Fabio and his brother Luciano would roll them into paper tubes and hit each other with them when fighting. Comic books would become one of Mauri's very first vehicles for artistic expression. Initially, the artist created his own illustrated stories. Then, during the late 50s, he would cut sections out of comic strips such Popeye, Flash Gordon, and Bringing Up Father, and incorporate them into his paintings. Bringing Up Father was a daily comic strip created by George McManus that was published in the United States from 1913. In Italy, it was renamed Arcibaldo Petronilla, and from 1921, it appeared in Il Corriere dei Piccoli, which was one of the first magazines for young readers in Italy. During the 1940s, it was also featured in Mondadori's Topolino comic book series. Mauri was particularly struck by a scene from Arcibaldo Petronilla set in the darkness of a movie theater, in which the husband's head is seen from behind, along with those of other viewers. This image, which constitutes the basis for the lower part of the present drawing, is here transformed into a kind of frame, becoming a decorative motif that runs around all four sides of the central image and leads the eye into depth, making us feel as if we are moving towards the screen from the back of the theater. In this work, Mauri also experimented with a new technique that was known as the calcomania in Italy. This was a process whereby images from newspapers could be transferred in reverse onto a sheet of paper by means of a chemical solvent such as turpentine. Mauri's approach recalls that adopted by Robert Rauschenberg since 1952. Then between 1958 and 1960, he created 34 transfer drawings to illustrate the Inferno in collaboration with Dante scholar Michael Sonnabend, the husband of Ileana. Rauschenberg spent 2.5 years in close study of Dante's masterpiece and his composition, each of which corresponded to one of the poem's 34 cantos, were exhibited at MoMA between 1965 and 1966. However, it is significant to note that in 1959, Rauschenberg had already exhibited some of his drawings at the Galleria La Tartaruga in Rome, illustrating his pioneering adoption of the transfer technique. Rauschenberg's exhibition drew little attention from the critics, but certainly had a great influence on Roman artists, as Flavio Fergonzi recalls, and especially on Mauri, who lived on the same floor as the La Tartaruga Gallery. A Mauri screen, which is divided in two frames, we can make out the silhouette of men and women juxtaposed with the faces and bodies of the actors in an apotheosis of identification between the film spectator and its protagonist. For Mauri, the screen was the symbol of the mass media par excellence, of the prevailing ideology, and of the dreams and danger intrinsic to this means of communication. As in other works, it depicts the end of the film, the moment of emotional climax when a sense of pathos reaches its peak. In 1960, Mauri wrote the script and designed the costumes for the play L'Isola, or The Island, which was performed for the first time in 1964 in Spoleto. In it, mass culture was evoked by means of reference to comics instead of movie stills, and the play resembled a live-action cartoon. The actors spoke as if they were characters in a comic strip, while the sets, perfectly white clouds hanging in a blue sky, evoked the speech bubbles familiar from comics. Comics represented the most important American influence on Mauri's work, and L'Isola was the most complete expression of the artist's fascination with them. Mauri's imagery was particularly influential on the younger generation of Roman artists. Mauri's younger brother, Achille, recalls the frequent visits of Schifano, Tano Festa, and Franco Angeli to the house where he and Fabio lived. These younger artists were also aware of Mauri's reflection on the power of the mass media, cinema, radio, and television, and his references to popular culture and everyday items such as comics and newspaper. Cartoon-like white clouds in a perfectly blue sky also appear in a drawing made by Tano Festa in New York in December 1966, titled The Killer. It features a number of different elements, one of which is a single globe. This is a direct quotation from Giorgio de Chirico painting The Song of Love, which belongs to MoMA, and which has become a part of Italy's art historical heritage, embedded in the public consciousness. It must have been a source of great pride at the time for an Italian artist to arrive in New York and find a room entirely dedicated to de Chirico at the MoMA, and particularly so for Festa, who consider him to be an undisputed master. Beneath the metaphysical glove is the profile of a sawn-off hand, colored pink and shedding 2 drops of blood, thereby alluding in an almost playful cartoon-like way to the title of the work. The saw obviously refers to Jim Dine's famous series of works depicting tools. In fact, by the time he created this work, Tano Festa had known Dine for several years. In 1962, Sidney Yanis had invited both artists to take part in a group show titled New Realists. Festa saw his work again in the American Pavilion at the Venice Biennale of 1964, together with the paintings by Jasper Johns. By including the 2 clouds in his depiction of the saw, Festa aimed to personalize the object, transforming it in accordance with his own signature cartoon style. The third element of this drawing is represented by a painting that seems to be falling from above, as indicated by 3 directional lines. The painting itself would appear to allude to Jasper Johns' pictorial style, although I don't believe that Tano Festa had a specific painting in mind. It reproduces the artist's brush strokes in a vivid color and is traveling in the same direction in a very artificial way. The final element of the drawing is a girl running with a hoop, which is, of course, another reference to de Chirico, being taken from his painting Mystery and Melancholy of the Street. This figure is one of de Chirico's most recognizable motifs and conveys a vivid sense of foreboding. Here, she seems to be running away from the scene of the crime and may even represent the key to solving the mystery of his visual detective story. She is the last of these 4 stills life selected by the artist as representative of that particular moment in art history. A moment in which all these symbols coexisted between the reception of New Dada in Rome and the creation of pop art in the United States. In a letter from New York written during the same year as this drawing, Festa wrote to the Milanese gallerist Arturo Schwarz, "The object began to assume metaphysical valence beyond the limits of human existence. They were able to remain, despite the time given to each mortal being, and make us feel a sense of ambiguity and helplessness in front of their physical, inorganic, obtuse being, and even a sense of the mystery and impenetrability of their cold and dark forms." Festa translated American Neo-Dada into Italian by way of the metaphysical object, incorporating elements from the real world and references to de Chirico's painting as an iconic Italian artistic landscape. Festa's approach can be summed up in his ironic observation that we live in a country where instead of consuming canned foods, we consume the image of the Mona Lisa on chocolates. And this is the end. To quote Fabio Mauri's work and scream, "Fine." Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Irina. Thank you. That was really a fascinating presentation. It's now my pleasure to welcome Francesco Guzzetti. Hello, Francesco.
Hello everyone from Lecco.
Francesco is visiting professor at the University of Florence. He holds his doctorate in art history from the Scuola Normale Superiore in Pisa. His studies revolve around the international connections of Italian art in the 1960s and the 1970s and the drawing practices of arte povera artists. His research has been supported by various fellowships and grants from institutions such as the CUNY Graduate Center and CIMA in New York, the Centre Pompidou in Paris, Harvard University, Magazzino Italian Art Foundation in Cold Spring, and the Drawing Institute at the Morgan Library and Museum in New York. He curated the wonderful exhibition, Paper Media, Boetti, Calzolari, Cunellis at the Samuel Dorsky Museum of Art at SUNY New Paltz in 2019. He is also the curator of the exhibition Facing America, Mario Schifano, 1960 to 1965, currently on view at Cima in New York, which has online tours, so please take advantage. He is currently preparing a manuscript based on his dissertation that explores the connections between arte povera and American art in the early 1970s. So thank you, Francesco, welcome, and I'll turn things over to you now.
Thank you, Saskia, for the nice introduction. Let me share my screen and thank you, everyone. And I would like to thank especially the organizers of the symposium and the staff at the Menil for their support throughout the preparation of this paper. In my paper, I focus on the practice of the Greek-born Italian artist Yannis Kounellis at the turn of the 1980s. This period in the artist's career coincided with a moment of substantial exposure in the United States. By focusing on a group of works exhibited in New York, I aim to concentrate on the relationship between Kounellis and American art. Kounellis was extremely critical towards the latest tendencies in American art and repeatedly asserted through his work and statements his European and even more Italian and Greek roots. This opposition sounds like a provocation in the context of a panel devoted to Italian and American interconnections, but it's actually more complex than it might seem. Strictly related to each other, drawing and painting had always been distinctive of the practice of Kounellis. The artist's early body of work, realized a few years after he moved to Rome, consists of the so-called alphabets, a group of drawings and paintings created between 1958 and 1963. Scholars such as Dieter Schwartz have already extensively demonstrated how certain American art was a primary source of inspiration for the artist. Due to a solid network of relationship with the United States, the vibrant artistic scene in Rome facilitated the artist's encounter with the work of American artists, including Franz Klein and especially Jackson Pollock, whose exhibition at the Galleria Nazionale d'Arte Moderna in Rome in 1958 left a vivid impression on him. Kounellis had always considered himself as a painter, even when he abandoned the practice and apparently dismissed painting in favor of three-dimensional installations. That moment coincided with the artist's association to the group of Arte Povera in the late 1960s. In 1972, Kounellis was able to expand on the significance of painting in a long interview with Willoughby Sharp. At the time, the artist had just resumed the practice within some works involving music and dance. In those works, which Kounellis didn't consider performances at all, the actual execution of an excerpt of music and the pictorial rendering of the score inscribed on canvas converge. The painting substitutes the performance, retaining an echo of the atmosphere of the execution in the loose strokes layered on its surface, and triggers the viewer's imagination by interchanging visual and auditory components in the legibility of the piece. In the interview with Sharp, Kounellis rejected the traditional consideration of painting as an end in itself, whose importance depends on the intrinsic value assigned to it by an idealistic culture. On the contrary, painting was for Kounellis a mentality, a mode to view and re-elaborate the artist's vision of the world into the artistic field. And as such, painting extends to any possible media or practice the artist investigated, drawing included. In artist's words, quote, painting establishes a dialectic between structure and sensibility. Without structure, you cannot have a dialectic. Painting represents a continuing, commonly held aesthetic. It's a historical witness, a connecting link, end quote. The alternative between structure and sensibility is fundamental in Kounellis' art. Drawing resonates with the notion of structures on multiple levels. First, it represents a visual principle of ordering and partitioning space, which engenders by reaction the response of sensibility, meaning the multifaceted experience of the world as encapsulated by the diverse sensations stemming from the relationship with the artwork. Furthermore, drawing is a structure by virtue of the inevitable connection with historical reference to its own tradition. Cunellis then envisioned sensibility as both a sensuous and mental response, combining the contingency of experience and the memory of the past. The artist consistently resumed the practice of drawing towards the end of the 1970s, and I show you here two drawings belonging to a series which actually marked the return to drawing in Cunelli's work in the 1970s. Responding to the general social and cultural crisis defining those years in Italy and elsewhere, the work of Cunellis in the 1970s was increasingly imbued with a pervading sense of tragedy. The artist owned a reference to the past through an outstanding series of works in which he revealed a commitment to contemporary issues, while at the same time reviving historic memory. Cunellis' art was deeply affected by the cultural heritage of his native Greece and the humanist tradition of Italy, which he saw as the prosecution of classical art and philosophy. The artist integrated such lineage to a restricted pantheon of literary and artistic references, ranging from late 19th and early 20th century Northern and Central European culture to Byzantine icons, from Van Gogh and Picasso to Jackson Pollock. Such diverse references coalesce in a group of drawings that Cunellis created in 1980, which perfectly encapsulate the artist's vision. The group consists of large-scale works on paper in which fields of mask-like faces are rapidly delineated with thick strokes of black ink. Filling the entire surface of the paper sheets, the faces resemble the layers of skulls accumulated on the walls of ancient cemeteries. Their expressionist rendering is indebted to the art of Edvard Munch, whom the artist had long admired for what he called his dark silence and the moving capacity to express the human drama. The idea of a theater implied by the notion of human drama resonated with Cunellis on multiple levels, as conveyed by the imposing size of these sheets and the particular way how the artist decided to install them, by lining up several pieces of this series on the walls instead of exhibiting single versions individually. The first presentation took place at Galleria Mario Diacono in Rome, where Cunellis hung 4 drawings on 2 contiguous walls. Leaving a small space between the works, the artist emphasized the sense of a population of mask-like faces compressed in a relatively confined space. The artist had already achieved a similar sense of compression and tragic grandeur in works which he started to create in 1969 by walling up doorways with different kinds of materials. The size and the vertical orientation of the paper sheets in the 1980 series is reminiscent of those works. Since the beginning of his practice, windows, doors, as well as the standard-size bed frames resonated with Cunellis as elements which define, limit, and partition the living space, separating private and public spheres. By appropriating these elements, Cunellis turned them into units of measurement, which refer to everyday and intimate life and symbolize universal human condition at the same time. Blocking up a passageway, Cunellis didn't occlude, but rather revealed the image. In January 1980, the artist sealed up a door in the gallery of Mario Pieroni, filling it entirely with plaster casts of fragments of classical sculptures, mostly heads. The sense of horror vacui of the installation and the rendering of the heads in the preparatory sketch seemed to prefigure the large drawings it would make a few months afterward. The following installation of 16 works on paper from the series at Sonnabend Gallery in New York at the end of 1980 emphasized the sense of drama of these drawings. The drawings resonate with each other by virtue of their composition. Devoid of any center or internal hierarchy, each work is based on the accumulation of similar shapes all over the surface of the paper. Even if they're not totally abstract, but retain a trace of barely recognizable figuration, such composition, alongside the gestural quality of the strokes of ink, attest to the artist's admiration for Jackson Pollock's action painting. Quote, although far from our ideas of tradition, Cunellis said in 1978, Pollock also accomplished a dramatic and passionate search for identity, end quote. Going beyond artistic traditions and cultural conventions, Pollock's work embodies the alternative opposing structure and sensibility. He subverted artistic convention by going beyond the limitations of canvas and the traditional practice of easel painting. and he made a strong criticism of the social and cultural conventions of America by virtue of a visual culture which he intensely nourished. In Cornellis's words, quote, "Before Pollock, in America, art reflected the colonial attitude of the country. Pollock made a very severe criticism of this sort of mentality. He went to Mexico and discovered the murals, the Indian paintings, and he understood Mondrian, experiencing it all very intensely. That was his way of criticizing society," end quote. The association of history of art and history of society, culture and life, the acknowledgement of present situation and the consciousness of the past coalesce in Pollock's paintings to the extent that, quote, "he's both the father and the mother of American art," end quote. By referencing Pollock, Cornellis addressed the sense of the political status of the artist as socially and culturally aware creators who elaborate universal representations of concerns which they first intensely experienced in their own life. As he said in a 1977 interview, quote, "I'm not able to see the artist as a private thing," end quote. The exhibition at the Sonnabend Gallery was positively reviewed in the American journals. The artist looked steeped in European tradition and a powerfully theatrical imagist, as the critic of Art Forum wrote. In the 1980s, Cornellis regularly exhibited at Sonnabend Gallery in New York, and furthermore was granted a crucial retrospective at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago in 1986. Such a recognition led to the inclusion of the artist in the anthology of articles published by the art critic Donald Caspit in 1988. Under the title The New Subjectivism, Art in the 1980s, the book gathers several articles published by Caspit in the previous years, rearranged in a sequence which was functional to articulate critics' take on the defining trait of the art of the 1980s, both in Europe and America. Caspit acknowledged the differences separating American artists from their peers overseas, but attempted anyway to find a common ground, laying in the search for identity and the expression of the artist's own subjectivity, often through the revival of figurative art. Cornellis is the only artist to whom a chapter of the book was devoted, the only Italian artist to whom a chapter of the book was devoted, while the largest part of the section on European art was assigned to German art. German expressionism and his legacy perfectly fit Caspit's vision of the restoration of European art, as he put it, meaning that the search for identity by European artists at the end of the 1970s preceded the subjectivism sought after by the Americans and was deeply burdened by the modernist tradition. The chapter on Cornellis builds upon his process of symbolization, meaning the transformation of any materials and figures into icons by virtue of their treatment and the emphasized emptiness of the gallery spaces where the works are exhibited or rather exposed. Caspit noticed some defining traits of Cornellis's art, such as the importance of fragments as images of incompleteness and lost unity. Nonetheless, by resorting to terms like alchemy and fetishism, Caspit failed to acknowledge the interconnectedness between the artist's own experience and the representation of broader social and cultural issues through his art. The investigation of subjectivism undertaken by Donald Caspit responded to the new figurative and revivalist trends spreading among American and European artists belonging to the generation rising to prominence at the end of the 1970s. Falling under various names, including New Expressionism or Trans-Avant-Garde, these tendencies mark the restoration of a figurative style which Cornellis couldn't and most importantly didn't want to fit within. The artist immediately perceived the risk of being associated with a new rampant generation of artists with whom his work had nothing to share. Since the late 1970s, Cornellis claimed the rights of his own generation vis-à-vis the new art, which inevitably looked superficial to him. In the essay in the catalog accompanying the 1986 retrospective in Chicago, Thomas McKeeverly brilliantly addressed such issue. Based on the consideration that history is, quote unquote, an overpowering fact for Cornellis, McKeeverly introduced the distinction between artists whose work is informed by historical and social consciousness and artists whose work often very deliberately avoids such involvement. From the point of view of an artist like Cornellis, who clearly belonged to the first group and believed in the expression of broader political contents through art involving being in history and belonging to it, the new tendencies were a betrayal of the seriousness of the artist's role, based on their belief that history was over and ideology dead. The aim to regain the totality of human cultural and social condition, as expressed by artists in remote and recent past, was the core of Cornelis's art. At a moment of crisis, such totality was inevitably lost and could only be expressed through fragments, such as the mask-like faces stratified on the paper sheets in the drawings made in 1980. For Cornelis, the new artist, as McKeevely wrote in 1986, quote, made a faked return to totality, faked because it ignores history. The current enthusiasm for their work, which centers in America, a country where World War II was not directly experienced, represents an escapist desire to shrug off the responsibility of history, end quote. The installation at Sonnabend Gallery was especially powerful in this respect. Cornelis, in fact, installed a work comprised of a pile of slates placed below a smoke-stained palette attached to the wall. Close to the corner of the room, the work represented a sort of conclusion of the path, the proximity to the contiguous wall being essential to demarcate its function as a unit of measurement and a point of arrival in the visual narrative of the show. Smoke, soot, and ashes were logical materials for Cornelis, who consistently used them throughout his career. As the residue of a burned substance, soot evokes absence and symbolizes memory and nostalgia, reflecting Cornelis's vision of the lost totality defining the situation of Western culture at the time. Drawing itself as a medium represented the sense of history, that structure facing which the sensibility is activated in Cornelis's vision. As the installation at Sonnabend Gallery demonstrated, the artist never assigned an ancillary position to his works on paper, by virtue of the primary value in defining the artist's own identity, which the medium of drawing assumed in regards to the tradition of disegno, which the artist resorted to and reassessed in his practice. The artist articulated his own identity also as a claim of cultural and generational belonging, as opposed to American art too. The admiration for Pollock coincided, in fact, with the artist's criticism towards the tendencies which emerged after him, including pop art, minimal art, and conceptual art. In his extremely precise vocabulary, Cornelis identified such tendencies with a notion he had dismissed since the beginning of his practice, which is the concept of style. Considering it a formula to easily categorize artists by virtue of the merely formal features of their works, Cornelis meant by style a purely idealistic and formal concept, devoid of any actual connection with that sense of history which should imbue the artistic representation. Rejecting the notion of style, Cornelis claims the right to incorporate an extremely diverse, multifaceted range of media, compositions, and installations within his practice, thus creating a highly evocative body of work which is neither rigorously abstract nor entirely realist, and defies any associations to categories. The artist's conception of painting and drawing as a mentality rather than an actual medium, which I expanded on above while discussing the 1972 interview with Willoughby Sharp, falls into his vision of his practice at large. Applied to the American art of the 1960s and 70s, the notion of style was strictly related to the artist's belief of the unbridgeable distance separating American and European artists of his generation. As opposed to the anti-historical implications of the concept of style, the sense of history was in fact intended as the link to a heritage which had been stratified throughout the centuries. As a synonym for cultural heritage, stratification is another crucial word in the artist's vocabulary. Significantly, several works of Cornelis actually consist of different layers of materials stacked and piled over each other, including the stratification of faces in the works on paper presented at Sonnabend Gallery in 1980. Making art requires, on the part of the artist, to embark into a journey in space and time, excavating the roots on which to build up the art. Journey is the dimension of the search for identity. Jackson Pollock's deep exploration of diverse cultural sources, ranging to ancient native and Mexican art to Mondrian, in order to convey the sense of totality implied by his works, and at the same time criticize the model of American culture, was rejected and betrayed in Cornellis's vision by the American artists who followed him. The art of a highly consumerist society, as the United States were for Cornellis in the 1960s and 1970s, couldn't be anything but a sequence of styles, immediately recognizable and quickly consumed, without any sense of historic consciousness. Such evolutionary process culminated in the new revivalist and figurative art emerging at the end of the 1970s. For Cornellis, Pollock was ultimately a model of epicness, a term banned by the latest artistic tendencies, which by contrast was another keyword in Cornellis's practice. Epicness, in fact, defined the sense of commitment and risk which artists take in navigating history, searching for identity. That notion was especially at stake on the occasion of the 1986 retrospective in Chicago. As explained by the curator Mary Jane Jacob in the acknowledgement of the catalog, the 2 years long process, which resulted in a comprehensive selection spanning the artist's whole career for the first time in North America, didn't start out that easily. Jacob wrote, quote, "To Cornellis, the question remained of how to have a dialogue with America when we speak different language, hold different social, political, and aesthetic position, in spite of our bond of Western culture. In answering this challenge, Cornellis found Chicago to be historically important, a great and beautiful city, and the ideal context within which to create a dialogue," end quote. Cornellis found a great sense of epicness in Chicago's architecture, in the sense of history stratified into the buildings, by the streets, and around the neighborhoods of the city. So he decided to create or reenact site-specific installations, such as Tragedia Civile, Civil Tragedy, in 4 locations outside of the building of the Museum of Contemporary Art, by choosing former industrial buildings and abandoned peripheral sites whose grand space and tragic and nostalgic allure made them the perfect context for the artist's works. As the large 1980 drawings turned the Sonnabend Gallery into an observatory in which we are scrutinized by the haunting presence of the faces which we are confronted by, so the installations conceived by Cornellis in Chicago turned the structural elements of each space into active components of the work, accommodating the presence of functioning elements such as the toy trains and echoing their significance as fragments of history. As usual in his practice, Cornellis made drawings of these installations. Once again, it's hard to place these sheets within the category of preparatory sketches. They don't contain exact renderings or useful notes, and rather they encapsulate the essential expressive elements of the installation. Quote, "I always calculate things entirely from dreams in my drawings. Works are something quite different," end quote, the artist said in a 1985 interview. The gestural marks of black ink, defining the ceiling and the floor of the room, in the drawings to the left, set up the atmosphere of darkness of the space, the structure of which would be lit by the sensibility embodied and liberated by the installation. To conclude, the 1980 exhibition at Sonnabend Gallery, as well as many other works on paper made by Cornellis in the 1980s, mark the role of drawing as the medium through which the artist defines his cultural and generational identity. He actually aligned them at the same level as the three-dimensional installations. I would like to resort to the artist's own words and read a statement published in a Spanish magazine in 1982, which I hope will help summarize the major points interspersed in this presentation. "I am against the world of Andy Warhol and the epigony of today. I want to restore the climate experienced by the Cubists. I am against the condition of paralyzation to which the post-war has reduced us. By contrast, I search among fragments, emotional and formal, for the scatterings of history. I search dramatically for unity, although it's unattainable, although it's utopian, although it is impossible, and for all these reasons dramatic. I search for the world of which our vigorous and arrogant 19th century forebears left us examples of revolutionary form and context. I am an admirer of Pollock for his dramatic and impassioned search for identity. I am an expert traveler. I know all the tortuous routes of my land of Europe, the mountain path, and the big cities with their passionate stories and gossip. I like the pyramids of Egypt. I like Caravaggio. I like Van Gogh. I like the Parthenon. I like Rembrandt. I I like Kandinsky. I like Klimt. I like Goya. I like the impetus of the winged victory of Samothrace. I like medieval churches. I like the character of Ophelia as Shakespeare describes her, and I honor the dead, thinking of myself that I am a modern artist. Thank you very much for your attention.
Francesco, thank you so much. A fascinating and very rich paper, and you ended with such a impassionate note from the artist, which feels like such a strong and clear declaration of identity. And identity is actually a thread, an issue that unites all three papers in a way, whether personal identity of the artist or national identity. And you've shared with us some really amazing examples, ranging from a fairly wholehearted embrace, even though, potentially slightly ambiguous in the case of Fortunato De Pero, to something one could term critical engagement in the case of Cunelis. And we also shared with us the idea of that risks are involved, risks that could be personal in terms of seeing one's identity sort of questioned, but also there can be commercial risks in a way. And I wanted to ask you, all three of you, if you could speak to that issue a bit more, but also tell us if you think that drawing as a medium had a particular role to play in negotiating identity. Francesco, you mentioned this traditional view of drawing coming from the Renaissance, where because drawing is generated by the hand of the artist, it's the closest to the spirit of the artist and therefore identity. And so could you speak to that?
Absolutely. Well, actually, that's exactly one of the defining traits of Cornelis's attention to drawing, especially throughout the 1970s and then in the 1980s, really as a medium where to negotiate his own identity. And for Cornelis was absolutely conscious of the coincidence of his own identity, his own experience, and the belonging to a broader generational first and then cultural lineage. Really how he elaborated the various, a lot of really a diverse range of media and techniques on paper, and how he was able to incorporate and align these works on paper with other type of works, as he did in the 1980 exhibition at Cometa Gallery with 16 large drawings, and then these weird composition of these pile of slates and the smoke stained palette really is a declaration of how for him drawing was absolutely standing at the same level as any other possible medium and material in negotiating his identity and making a cultural and generational statement out of it.
Thank you. So I wonder if Raffaele or Irina, you want to speak to that?
Go ahead.
I was thinking of about national identity. The glove we just seen, the Chirico rubber surgeon's glove, or for example, the tomb, the Michelangelo tombs. Of course, for Italian artists, they has always been an innate gift, the cultural heritage, and which they were born. So as Tano Festa said, we live with Mona Lisa on chocolate. The problem is when it could be a burden too. I mean, when it blocks from freedom in creation, it could also be an inspiring force. The challenge is to translate it, this heritage in a language that could speak internationally. That's the difficulty, I think, that has always been for Italian artists in an international context.
Raffaele?
Yeah, I think that, yeah, for Kali too, this was really central, and I would say that at least in the period that I was discussing, there is a transformation and a trajectory, in the sense that in the 1930s, Kali is really invested in this idea of a national identity and constructing a language for this a new era of the third Rome of fascism, and he had this idea of art practice as a public role and political responsibility. So we can also say that in the moment when he's excluded from that very collectivity he was trying to construct a language for, then he starts this process of elaborating ideas of identity as fragmented, constructed, and constantly negotiated. So he's already in the 30s, he had written about logic multiple, multiple logics that coexist in a person. And then that idea really develops further after the exile into what he described as percorsi paralleli, like trajectories that happen. And it's really interesting, you were asking about the specific role of drawing. In painting, Kali was often accused of eclecticism, especially after the war, because he deliberately embraced this kind of schizophrenic mode of operation. But drawing was kind of the way to keep those various pieces connected. So it's and it changed really in the, across the war divide.
And if I may say, I love the drawing of his atelier, where you see this sort of exploded, impossible space, but what brings everything together is the line. So quite an apt symbol. Saskia, do you have questions for our panelists?
Yeah, so one of the things that I think today we've heard obviously about, a lot about how artists were digesting their experiences of the United States through drawing and bringing that back to Italy. We've heard about, artists kind of responding to American precedents like Pollock and Gorky. And then a lot about the kind of cultural diplomacy. But one area that I think, we didn't quite touch on, and I'm interested to hear if any of you came across this in your research, is the idea of Italian drawings collecting, or Italian artists collecting drawings from artists in the United States, because as Raffaele very, well pointed out, these are a very mobile form of art. They can easily be collected. They're not often very expensive. Artists often exchange them. I'm thinking of Boetti, who, I think in his Muro is actually incorporating works that he was, getting from American friends and from friends in Italy as well. So I wanted to know if any of you kind of had come across instances of artists in Italy collecting drawings from their American peers, and how that might have happened, and yeah, what impact that had. And it might even if it's not, touching upon your specific topic, I imagine you all have maybe come across this in other ways.
Who goes first?
You go ahead.
I go ahead. Okay.
Yes.
That's a really interesting question. I highly doubt that, considering his vision of like the American art of his own generation, Cornelis would ever buy or like collect a drawing by a conceptual or a minimalist or a post-minimalist artist. But in my other research, I actually just a few I like recently came across to an interesting case of in the other way around, I would say, which is preparing the Schifano exhibition. I came across a bunch of Schifano's drawings in the private collection of Robert Rauschenberg. And these was kind of an interesting, it still is an interesting subject. I haven't really come to a conclusion about how they enter into Rauschenberg collection, if it's for a direct exchange with Schifano in New York, or maybe through Ileana Sonnabend, who for a while was a kind of like bridge between the two of them. Ileana Sonnabend for a while was the dealer of Schifano. So And that's exactly fits within this idea of like the mobility of drawings that you just mentioned. And on the other hand, I think that through like the networks of dealers and galleries, drawings definitely circulated between the two shores of the Atlantic in the 60s and 70s. And that would definitely facilitate the encounter between the artists, yeah.
Yeah, maybe I share some of the impressions that Francesco had. Drawings, were often shared via mail too. So sometimes you have letters, and within the letters, drawings. So yeah, Afro with the Kooning, for example, there are instances of that kind. And also, I would add with writers, this kind of exchange of collaborations of drawing plus text. So, for example, Kali in particular was really interested in the collaboration with poets. So when he left Italy, actually, his partner was Libero De Libero, a poet, and so the first period when Kali was in the United States, they would exchange, and there was this idea of a correspondence between the two mediums. And then the other way around, in the United States, he met Charles Olson, and so they did books. Actually, the first book of poems by Olson was in collaboration with Kali, and so their correspondence is filled with drawings and writing from both ends. But it's really interesting because I then when you ask your question, which is really great, I was like trying and think like, are there like actual collections, and I couldn't come up with any specific. So I don't think that there was at least the examples of artists I've considered, there wasn't any systematic effort at collecting, but it was more a casual kind of event. So, for example, Kali had many drawings by Eugène Berman, was a neo-romantic artist, and they were close. So he would have the drawings, and then he would show the drawings to the Obelisco Gallery in Rome, and then they decided to do a show, right? So those kind of situations.
I think it was also a very intimate gift that reveals an aspect of drawing, which is intimacy. So it was like to write a letter to a friend, or maybe today could be translated as giving a photo to a friend. It was a way of showing friendship and yes, intimacy. Yeah, for example, Afro had some drawings by Gorky that actually the widow gave him when he organized the show, or Afro take for his entire life the drawings with the dedication by the Koenig. I think it was like as a prize of a friendship. Today it's impossible, basically.
I think actually, do we have time for another couple questions?
Yeah, I think a couple of questions.
Because you actually just kind of touched on something. Oh, well, Raffaele, if you didn't know. Oh,
no, I had a question, but go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
No, my question was about criticality and anti-Americanism, which is something that Francesco brought up right, at the very beginning, and then it was really intertwined in his paper, which I think is really crucial as we are talking about the exchange and relationship. And one thing that I would like to point out, and then I have a question, is that the Koenig is part of. There is a generational shift, right? And you were talking about the drawing as part of a generational identity, And I would say that the generation of Cunellis, as opposed to the previous one of, say, Afro or even Tano Festa, had a shift in understanding what American or pro-American or anti-American could mean, in the sense that when Pollock exhibited in Italy, or when Rauschenberg exhibited at the Biennale, that was understood as the United States, right? As kind of the official presence of America, and it would be understood as something representing the nation in general. Whereas towards the second half of the 1960s, this is something like Umberto Eco wrote about. There was a clear distinction between what was the official culture and what was the countercultural presence in the United States. So someone like Celant, and so I don't know so much Cunellis. I would like to know from you. Someone like Celant, had a very clear distinction between the civil rights movement, the student protest in Berkeley, Susan Sontag. They are all part of the good America, from which actually we can learn quite a bit. And then there is the United States of of the Cold War and Vietnam, et cetera, which of course is something we are fighting against, and the American imperialism that affects Italy as well. And so my question would be, one, if you think that Cunellis made that kind of distinction, and two, whether drawing would have something specific to say in this field as maybe a mode of operation that is less codified as official important art, the art of the masterpieces.
That's interesting. That's super interesting. I think that from the point of view of an artist, of like a truly like conscious of his, an artist truly conscious of his role as Cunellis was, these distinctions were kind of blurred, because like the 1958 exhibition of Pollock was really a breakthrough revelation for Cunellis. And when he was like also wrote, or like in interviews especially, was against American art, he didn't really make any distinction, and actually minimal or conceptual art for him was really something he stood against, from the point of view of the fact that it's not a matter of like where you just stand on the sides of history, but it's how you interpret your role as an artist vis-a-vis history and present condition. And for him, it seems that like it didn't really matter where like these figures were in the historic perspective, but how like the new tendencies leading to the trans-avant-garde and the revival of figuration of the late 70s, early 80s, were somehow kind of more interested in making a style out of like their hypothetical, like historic or social commitment. While for him, the notion of style was not related at all with the very essence of the artistic practice. And the artist changes constantly depending on the moment he lives in and the vision of the world he develops through the moments he lives. So I think that Cunellis really stood kind of a part of that. And in general, like this is the big difference between the critics' take on the situation and the artist's take on the situation. And especially this kind of artist, I would say. And drawing, again, Cunellis was not afraid to quote like Irina's exhibition title, was not afraid of drawing, and was not afraid of like including drawing in exhibition, in installation, even in performances, even if he didn't like the word, let's say performances. Because for him, it's really all part of his whole idea of artistic practice and what he called painting. Painting for him is a mentality, is a logic to make art. It's not like the medium of painting. For him, painting coincided with art. So any kind of media, any kind of like material was allowed as long as the vision was like truly committed and representative. So it's, Cunellis is really a figure, a kind of weird, and like figure like aside of these vis-a-vis the broader like tendencies and trends of like interpreting American culture. from the Italian side, I would say, especially between the 70s and
I'm sorry, Francesco, we actually have a question from the audience. And so it is for Raffaele. And the person asked if you had ever thought of interpreting Kali's drawings of David and Goliath and the other allegories criticizing fascist visual tropes as belonging to the tradition of political satirical illustrations. And the person wonders if this could be an appropriate frame for interpretation for him.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that in Italy in the 1930s, it was really common for artists to cross that boundary of fine arts and political satire or illustration. Like Sironi was probably the most influential artist in fascist Italy, and throughout his career he constantly made illustrations and satirical drawings for Il Popolo d'Italia and for other newspapers, and so many others did. I think that for Kali, that was at least in his intentionality, if we want to consider that. In his intentionality, that was not the realm within which he was operating. I think Kali had a sense of quite old-fashioned idea of the humanistic tradition and the synthesis of the arts, and so the conversation was more with music, with theater, so those had a political role. So he thought that was a public statement, any work of art. But I would say that probably he would not include the drawing. So he would exhibit them on a regular basis, and in some cases he would also publish them in magazines. He did that throughout the career, but I don't think as that. So, for example, even the drawings of the war. They were published in Harper's Bazaar and also in Allied sponsored magazines like Il Mese was this magazine published in London but in Italian language and then distributed in Italy. So with a strong political role, but they were art. And he made clear that that's how they would be situated. But of course, I think from the perspective of scholarship, the comparison stylistically and as a kind of long-term tradition, I think it would be really productive as an operation.
Great. So I think one last question, and I take the liberty to pose it, and this is a question for Irina, and it's about Maori's interest in comics. And of course, this, many of us alluded to Roy Lichtenstein in the American context. And so I was wondering whether you had thoughts about how their views of comics were contrasted.
Thank you, Edouard. Yes, if I think about comics in the United States, I think about Lichtenstein. And I think that he, for example, he started from comics to make his images iconic, I would say, as in classical beauty. While for Maori, low culture was a way to point out the danger of mass media coming from the US, as movies, for example, or so the mass media powered, and comics like cartoons could be vehicles of messages that could manipulate consciences. So low culture for Maori remains low, but means alert. while for Liechtenstein, it becomes high in a way that it's a way to transform reality into ideal. Mauri was surrounded by comics as if they were the wallpaper of his childhood. So for him, there were mundane, everyday scenario, and they have to remain this way. But they hide the danger. So I think that for Mauri, they never became high culture art. They never became iconic.
Thank you. And unfortunately, we're reaching the end of our time together. And we want to thank our great speakers today for sharing all their passion and research with everyone. Thank you to our audience for joining us. I just want to say before we part ways that the whole symposium was recorded and will be made available on the Menil's YouTube channel in the coming days. So in case you missed some of it, or you know of people who missed the symposium, please direct them in the right direction. And thank you again, and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.